Episode titled Lost Toy. It was a normal morning in the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa and George were playing. George was engrossed in his favorite toy, the dinosaur. However, this day was different. George realized that he had lost one of his old toys, a toy that had been with him before the dinosaur. It was a small plush bear. He decided he must find it. Peppa was busy and Mummy Pig was cooking. George thought it would be best to check the basement, a place he had never ventured into alone. He didn't know why, but the basement always seemed mysterious, something hidden from his sight. He approached the basement door, which was usually locked. To his surprise, it was slightly ajar. George peeked inside. A dark corridor with a few steps leading down. It was eerily quiet. He took a deep breath, held his dinosaur tightly, and went down. The steps were cold, and the air was damp. When George reached the bottom, he looked around. The basement was filled with old boxes, and in the corner there was a wardrobe, but nothing seemed unusual. He walked further, but then something caught his attention. A corner of a box was sticking out. He moved it aside and found the very toy, the small bear. George picked it up happily, but as he did, something shifted. The air grew heavy. The sound in the basement faded away. He felt the space around him begin to tighten. George didn't understand what was happening, but it felt strange and unsettling. He turned to head back up, but the stairs were gone. He tried to walk toward another wall, but it seemed farther away. The basement was growing bigger, and there was no way out. With every step, George felt the space around him changing. The walls expanded and contracted as if he were trapped. George tried calling out, "Mummy! Daddy!" but his voice was muffled and didn't reach the stairs. That's when he realized it wasn't just that he was stuck. He had entered another space. He looked at the bear. It wasn't just a toy. He noticed that its eyes had started to move slightly. This was impossible. It was a toy, but it was moving. George began to feel like his body wasn't responding. He tried walking toward the exit, but his steps grew slower and slower, as if time was stretching endlessly. The basement grew darker. Suddenly, he heard footsteps. They weren't his. Something was moving behind him. He turned around, but no one was there. He realized that there was something alive in this basement. Something was watching him, and the bear seemed to know what was happening. George gripped it tightly, but it stayed silent. After some time, George felt the basement starting to vanish. The space began returning to its original form. He found himself back at the stairs. But this basement was different. It was as it should have been. When George climbed back upstairs, everything was normal. Peppa was playing. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner. Everything seemed fine, but George felt that the basement was still somewhere in his memory. He looked at the bear. It was covered in dust, and its eyes were closed. Episode titled Creepy Dinosaur. Everything was calm at the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa and George were playing in the living room. Everything was as usual. George was holding his favorite dinosaur toy, the one he never left without. It was his most precious toy, always accompanying him in his games and staying by his side before bedtime. But something was different today. After breakfast, as George picked up his dinosaur again, he felt a strange sensation. The toy felt heavier than usual. At first, George thought it was just because he was tired, but with every movement, the toy became heavier, and its eyes began to look strangely bright. He glanced at the dinosaur and noticed that its eyes were moving. They weren't static like they usually were. They were following his every movement. "This is strange," George thought, but despite his discomfort, he continued playing. He started tossing the dinosaur into the air and catching it, but the toy didn't land like it usually did. It hovered in mid-air for a moment before slowly falling back into his hands. Peppa noticed that something was wrong with the dinosaur. She asked George, "Why doesn't your dinosaur fall when you throw it?" George replied that he didn't know and started to worry. He noticed that the toy seemed to be behaving as if it was trying to say something. The dinosaur looked at Peppa and, in a mechanical, hollow voice, said, "You don't have to be afraid of me." The words of the toy frightened George. He was holding the dinosaur, but it felt much heavier and colder. George felt a chill run down his spine as the toy repeated, "You don't have to be afraid of me." This was impossible. Toys can't talk. Suddenly, the dinosaur jerked and started moving on its own, leaving behind a barely noticeable trail. George, unsure of what was happening, followed it. The toy walked straight toward the exit of the room, then turned toward the staircase that led down. George didn't know what to do, but felt that he had to follow. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he noticed that the room where they usually gathered now looked eerie. The light dimmed and shadows began appearing on the walls. Then the dinosaur stopped. It stared directly into the dark corner of the room where nothing had been before. George approached, and before he could understand what was happening, the toy said, "He will come soon." At that moment, the door behind him slammed shut. George quickly ran upstairs. In the morning, everything seemed normal again, but George couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with his toy. The dinosaur was lying on the floor, just like before, but its eyes were still bright red. Episode titled George's Clones. It was a normal morning. Everything in the Pig family house was calm. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. Peppa came downstairs and said hello. George was playing on the floor with his dinosaur. Everything looked the same as always. After breakfast, George went outside. He walked along the path quietly saying, "Dinosaur." He reached the forest and walked inside. The forest was quiet. The trees were still. George walked further until he stopped. In front of him stood someone. It was him. Another George. He held the same dinosaur. They looked at each other. The other George did not move. Then he stepped forward. George did not step back. Then the other one quietly said, "Dinosaur." George nodded. In the next moment, he disappeared. George was alone again. During the day, the family went to the mountains. George walked along a path and looked down. Suddenly, he saw movement. Below him stood another George. He looked straight. Then he started moving upward. George stepped back, but the figure stopped and disappeared. In the evening, they returned home. George sat and played, but sometimes he looked toward the door, as if waiting. At night, George woke up. The house was quiet. He heard a creak. He got up and walked downstairs. The basement door was slightly open. George went down. It was dark. He held his dinosaur. In the corner, there was someone. Another George. He was not moving. Then he raised his hand. George did the same. Then the other stepped closer. George stayed still. Then he heard a step behind him. He turned around. There was another one. George was standing between them. He did not move. They did not move either. Then all of them said, "Dinosaur," at the same time. In the morning, everything looked normal. George was sitting on the floor playing. Peppa sat next to him. She looked at him. He smiled. Peppa looked at the floor. There were 3 identical dinosaurs. Then she looked at the window. In the reflection, there was another George standing behind them. Episode titled George's New Hands. Everything in the Pig family house started out like any other day. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa and George were playing in the living room. Everything was calm, but that day George started to feel a strange pain in his shoulders. He tried to continue playing, but the pain was growing stronger. He quietly complained to Peppa, and she told him to go to Mummy Pig. When George walked over to Mummy Pig, she looked at him with concern. "What's wrong, George?" she asked. "You don't look well." "My shoulders hurt, Mummy," George replied. "I feel something strange." Mummy Pig looked at his shoulders but saw nothing unusual. She suggested he rest, but soon George realized that something even stranger was happening to his body. Later that same day, as he played with his dinosaur, he felt something begin to grow on his arms. It started with a small pain, and then his skin seemed to move as though something was under it. At first, George thought it was some kind of strange dream, but when he touched his arms, he realized it was real. Soon, new small limbs began to grow on his arms. It started with fingers, and then full little arms that began to move as if they were alive. George was frightened. He quickly hid his arms behind his back and ran to Daddy Pig. "Daddy, what's happening?" he asked, desperately trying to conceal his new arms. Daddy Pig turned around, noticing his distress. "What's going on, George? What are you hiding?" When George showed him his new arms, Daddy Pig froze in place. He was silent for a moment before saying, This is strange. You shouldn't be changing like this." George didn't know what to do. He tried to control the new arms, but they moved on their own, as if they had a mind of their own. He tried to talk to them like his other body parts, but they wouldn't listen. And that's when George realized that these arms weren't just changing his body, they were beginning to make their own decisions. Mummy Pig heard their conversation and came to the kitchen. When she saw George's new arms, her face turned pale. "George, you need to lie down," she said. "We need to figure this out immediately." But George already knew that this wasn't just an illness or a temporary condition. He realized that his body was changing, but he didn't know what would happen next. That evening, as Peppa and George were getting ready to sleep, George's new arms began to move in the dark. He felt them reaching out toward the walls as if trying to grab something or learn something. George knew something more was going on with these arms, and it made him anxious. That night, George woke up to find that his new arms were no longer just arms. They had become something more. They began grabbing things around the room, moving on their own. He tried to stop them, but they were too strong and persistent. George couldn't hold back his fear any longer and decided that he needed to tell Peppa about what was happening. When Peppa saw what was happening to George, she was also scared. Together, they decided they needed to find a way to stop it. But was it even possible? And what if this was just the beginning of something worse? Episode titled A Strange Cave. It was a normal morning. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, Peppa came downstairs and said, "Good morning," and George was sitting on the floor playing with his dinosaur. He quietly repeated "dinosaur" while moving the toy around. Everything felt calm. After breakfast, George went outside. He followed a familiar road but turned earlier than usual and reached a hill. There was a cave. He did not remember seeing it before. The entrance was dark and silent. George stood there for a moment, then walked inside. The air felt cold. He took a step. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls. George said, "Dinosaur." And he heard an answer, but something was wrong. The sound came slightly before he finished saying the word. George stopped. He said, "Dinosaur," again, and again. The sound came first, as if someone already knew what he was going to say. George walked deeper. It became darker inside. He could hear his footsteps, but sometimes it felt like there were more than there should be. He stopped. The footsteps stopped too. George turned around. No one was there. He took another step, and again, the sound came before him. George started walking faster. He felt uneasy. Then he heard a voice. It sounded exactly like his own. "Dinosaur." But George was not speaking at that moment. He froze. In the darkness ahead, there was a figure. It looked like him, but it did not move. George stepped back. The figure did not repeat the movement immediately. George turned and walked out of the cave. He did not run, but he moved quickly. When he stepped back into the light, everything felt normal again. In the evening, George sat at home and played. Everything seemed calm, but sometimes he started to say dinosaur and stopped, as if waiting for the sound to come first. Peppa noticed this. At night, she woke up because of a quiet voice. She looked into the hallway. George was standing there. He was not moving. He softly said, "Dinosaur." But the sound came twice. In the morning, everything seemed normal. George was playing on the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, and for a moment it felt like the sound had already happened before he did.